Thank you again to everyone for being here. We are so grateful to have such a strong response to this amazing exhibition that we celebrate tonight, Bonaventure, a historic cemetery in art. Steeped in art and history, Bonaventure Cemetery is one of Savannah's most scenic locales, attracting visitors since the early 19th century. Bonaventure was visited by artists as early as the 1830s, and it continues to be an inspiration to artists today. This is the first exhibition to look at the nearly 200-year history of art inspired by Bonaventure or made by artists who worked at Bonaventure Cemetery from the 1830s to the present. The works in the show include those drawn from Telfair's permanent collection, as well as loans from national, regional, and local collections. Now, Bonaventure, as some of you may know, has very special connections to Telfair museums and its history. Bonaventure is the final resting place of the museum's founder, Mary Telfair. You may not have known that. Telfair's first director, Karl Brandt. The first board president, Henry Roots Jackson. Sculptor John Walt, who helped create sculptures outside the Telfair Academy, the 5 sculptures in front of it, and many other artists who are represented in the museum's collection. And of course, Bonaventure features prominently in the book Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil, both in the story and in its cover featuring the iconic Jack Leigh photograph of the Byrd Girl. And as many of you know, the Byrd Girl now resides here at the museum, and she alone draws many, many visitors to the museum each year. In fact, I have to say, over the past few days, as we were installing her, moving her into the galleries for this exhibition, we had to explain to several disappointed visitors why she was not on view. We even had to modify our exhibition schedule a little bit to minimize the time that she was not on view for our installation to the exhibition, just to avoid a riot. And I kid you not, literally an hour before I came down here, a visitor came to my office, as they often do. They just wander in, and she had to explain that she had driven 12 hours to come to Savannah just to see the Byrd Girl. So could I at least let her peek into the gallery to see her? So we are especially thrilled to be able to present this here. We know it's going to be a wonderful exhibition, both for the local community who can learn more about this really interesting topic, as well as to the visitors who come to Savannah to learn about our very special history. This exhibition, it looks amazing. I hope you had a chance to see it before you came in, or you can visit it again after the lecture. It's a wonderful opportunity for us to tell a really important story about Savannah. And it was curated by Harry DeLorme, our senior curator of education. I'm grateful to him for his work assembling this wonderful exhibition and for organizing tonight's panel of very special guests. So to introduce tonight's program and our guests, please welcome Harry DeLorme.
All right, so welcome everyone. Thank you guys so much for coming out tonight. Thank you, Lisa, for that wonderful introduction. Bonaventure Cemetery is a really special place, obviously special to all of you here in this room, I'm sure. And it's a place that, I mean, we could really barely scratch the surface of in an exhibition like this, or in a lecture, or even a series of lectures like we're going to do tonight. But we're going to try to give you a window into some different ways of thinking about Bonaventure in terms of why it's a special place, why it's attracted artists over the years, why it's this incredible repository of funerary art, all of these things. Hopefully we'll give you a little bit of a sense of that. Before we get started tonight, though, I really wanted to thank some others here who made this happen, our great curatorial staff, particularly Jessica Estes and Heath Rich and Milutin Pavlovich and Aaron Dunn, who all worked hard to get the exhibition up on the walls and on platforms and so on. They did a fantastic job. I'd also like to thank all of the lenders to this exhibition. We had lenders from across the country, from the National Gallery, from the from the Smithsonian American Art Museum to the Akron Art Museum to the Morris Museum in Augusta, the Johnson Collection, as well as private collections like the Miller Collection in Atlanta, David Miller's Southern Collection. We also had plenty of local lenders, including the City of Savannah, the Municipal Archives, the Department of Cemeteries loaned important materials to this show. Lots of wonderful private collectors who shared work out of their homes with us, including Dan and Virginia Mobley, Carmela Leafy, and many others locally. Lee and Judy Maltonfort, who couldn't be here tonight, from the Bonaventure Historical Society, and there are many others I'm probably forgetting. Please forgive me, but I'd like to thank everyone who contributed in any way, large or small, to making this exhibition happen. So we've got a lot of material to cover tonight, and we're going to try to do it pretty quickly, because afterwards we hope you'll stay for the reception and take a look at the show. And to get things rolling tonight, I wanted to give you just a little 20, 30-second history of Bonaventure. For those of you who don't know, most of you here I think are probably well aware of the history of Bonaventure, but just in case, to take us up to our first presentation, Bonaventure was established in the 1860s as a plantation on the Thunderbolt Bluff overlooking St. Augustine Creek, which we now call the Wilmington River, by Colonel John Mulrine. John Mulrine and his son-in-law, Josiah Tatnall, maintained that property until 1776, when, of course, things were happening in America, not the United States at that point, and British Governor Sir James Wright had to make his escape through Bonaventure, aided by Mulrine and Tatnall. The cemetery was not a cemetery at that time. Again, it was still a plantation. And it was used as a hospital during the siege of Savannah in 1779. In fact, some of the earliest burials that may be out there are French or even Haitian troops who fought in Savannah. We don't know that, but it's very likely that some of them were buried there. In 1782, after the ouster of the British, Bonaventure was confiscated as Loyalist property and sold to John Habersham. The Bonaventure was then repurchased by the Tatnall family by Josiah Tatnall Jr. in 1783. And in 1802, his wife became, the Harriet family became the first adult burial at Bonaventure in what would be the Tatnall family cemetery, small cemetery at that site. In 1846, Josiah Tatnall III, Commodore Josiah Tatnall, sells Bonaventure to Peter Wiltberger, who intends to develop 70 acres as a privately held public cemetery, privately operated public cemetery. Peter Wiltberger dies in 1853. His son, William Wiltberger, later takes over operation of Bonaventure, which at that time is called the Evergreen Cemetery at Bonaventure Plantation. And William Wiltberger sort of reforms the company and manages the property. The sale of lots increases because they are reduced in price a bit. And it's privately managed until 1907, when the city of Savannah purchases Bonaventure and renames it Bonaventure Cemetery. Other changes have happened since then. Obviously, in 1909, the Jewish section was added to Bonaventure. And of course, if you skip way ahead to 1994, that's when things really explode, when Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil is published and becomes an international bestseller and drives droves of folks to Bonaventure and to Savannah. And in 2001, Bonaventure is placed on the National Register of Historic Places. So that's just a very, very quick nutshell, just to give you a little bit of background before we begin these individual presentations. But again, what is it that makes Bonaventure truly special? Well, it's a great example of something called a rural cemetery. This was a movement towards cemeteries that were beautifully landscaped, that were these sort of reflective environments, places of leisure, as well as places to bury the dead. And to talk about that tonight, I'm pleased to have our first guest coming up, Dr. Christopher Hendricks, who is professor of history at Georgia Southern University's Armstrong campus. And he's here tonight to tell us more about the rural cemetery movement, give you an idea of where that came from, and in a way where Bonaventure came from. So please welcome Dr. Chris Hendricks.
In the 1820s, the United States had a population problem. People kept dying. The small burial churchyards and city burying grounds like Savannah's Colonial Cemetery were filling up. Land prices were rising, roads were being widened to accommodate more traffic, and outbreaks of diseases like cholera and typhoid fever had Americans worried about the safety of urban burials. Writing in 1849, the noted landscape designer and horticulturalist Andrew Jackson Downing observed, 20 years ago, nothing better than a common graveyard filled with high grass and a chance sprinkling of weeds and thistles was to be found in the Union. But there was a solution. Downing continued. At the present moment, there is scarcely a city of note in the whole country that has not its rural cemetery. The rural cemetery movement, 1833 to 1875, was the brainchild of a Boston doctor, Jacob Bigelow. He conceived of the notion in 1825, but it was another 5 years before he acquired the site for the first rural cemetery, Mount Auburn. 72 acres along the banks of the Charles River in Cambridge, Massachusetts, near the Harvard University campus. The presidents for Mount Auburn were the New Haven, Connecticut burying ground, 1796, now the Grove Street Cemetery, and Paris's Père Lachaise Cemetery of 1804. Both of these cemeteries were non-sectarian and free of both church and municipal oversight, and attempted to create park-like settings. This was an age when most aspects of American culture were being imported directly from Britain. The literary works of Sir Walter Scott, architectural tastes, and the like. But while rural cemetery designers were often influenced by English landscape gardening pioneer of the 18th century, Lancelot Capability Brown, this was a uniquely American movement, which in its turn influenced Britain. London's Abney Park Cemetery was established in 1840, copying Mount Auburn. During the Victorian era, styles emphasized the romantic and the natural. Nature became the ideal, and the new cemeteries were designed to provide sanctuary, solitude, quiet adornment, and beauty. It was common, especially on Sundays, for full families to picnic in the cemeteries. For many cities, these were the first parks. The emphasis on nature occurred at Mount Auburn from the very beginning. The design process was essentially hijacked by members of the newly formed Massachusetts Horticultural Society, led by General Henry Dearborn. With the assistance of a surveyor and a committee of leading Bostonians, Dearborn shaped the landscape, laying out curvilinear roads and paths that followed the natural contours of the land in 1831 and 32, naming streets after trees and plants. He established an experimental garden that included a wide variety of fruits, vegetables, flowers, and exotic plants of all types, and oversaw the planting of more than 1,300 trees. The result was inspiring. One visitor described it as a virtual paradise. The avenues are winding in the course and exceedingly beautiful in their gentle circuits, adapted picturesquely to the inequalities of the surface of the ground and producing charming natural landscape effects. Various small lakes or ponds of different size and shape embellished the grounds, presenting a pleasant feature in this widespread extent of forest loveliness. The moment was ripe for the rural cemetery, and other American cities quickly followed Boston's example. Philadelphia writer and horticulturalist John J. Smith created a joint stock company to purchase 32 acres of an estate near the city, overlooking the Schuylkill River, and Laurel Hill opened in 1836. After a visit to Mount Auburn in 1838, Baltimore tobacco merchant Samuel Walker worked to establish Green Mountain Cemetery as a combined rural cemetery and public walk to attract tourists as well as local residents. Not to be left out, the next year in 1839, real estate entrepreneur Henry H. Pierpont organized a voluntary association in New York and Brooklyn to acquire a charter for Greenwood Cemetery. One visitor wrote of Greenwood in 1842, "We love to dally on the road, to pluck a flower here and plant one there, and while away a little of our time in pursuit of pleasure among sanctified creations of nature." The romantic sensibilities of rural cemeteries inspired a number of reformers and moralists. Unitarian ministers William Ellery Channing and John Pierpont argued that pastoral cemeteries should serve as schools of moral philosophy and catalysts of civic virtue. They urged youths to visit Mount Auburn, to learn from the exemplary lives of notables interred there, and to be sobered by thoughts of the shortness of life. Youth were to return home with a new resolve to work hard and do good. Young people did indeed flock to the cemeteries, but actress and author Fanny Kimball noted it was more for trysting than anything else. And the romantic sentimentality could get a bit out of hand. Swedish visitor Karl David Arfvedson saw the grounds of Mount Auburn and paraphrased Keats. "A glance at this beautiful cemetery almost excites a wish to die." The popularity of the rural cemeteries grew quickly, and people flooded their walks, developing a tourist industry. Mount Auburn's first guidebook appeared in 1839. This is a later edition, just 4 years after it was opened. And by 1850, rival guidebooks were competing with one another. Nathaniel Dearborn's Guide Through Mount Auburn for the Benefit of Strangers featured moralist poems and sayings for people to contemplate as they strolled the grounds. Meanwhile, Dearborn's competitor, Levi Merriam Stevens, promised in his 1856 guide, and this is a later edition, called A Handbook for Passengers of the Cambridge Railroad, not to describe Mount Auburn as anyone thinks it should be, but to lead the visitor through the most interesting portions of the cemetery, to call attention to everything, all caps, on the route worthy of observation. Holidays like the 4th of July and New Year's Day caused a particular crush. Visitors mutilated trees because of the popular fad of whittling, gathered flowers, trampled fences, and sped through the cemetery's walks in their carriages. Cemetery owners put up signs, "Walk your horse, no fast driving," but to no avail. The Massachusetts General Court passed laws offering rewards for information that led to the conviction of whittlers and people discharging firearms. Mount Auburn resorted to requiring carriage drivers to purchase tickets. Out-of-town visitors of respectable appearance could get temporary tickets free of charge, and special passes were issued to lot owners and well-known, well-behaved individuals. By the way, in case you can't make it out, this is a picnic. They have the food laid out on the crypt there. Aside from the landscape and plantings, the monuments and statuary in the rural cemeteries were also a huge draw. In order to attract even more visitors to Philadelphia's Laurel Hill, John Smith purchased a sculptural group inspired by Sir Walter Scott's work Old Mortality by Scottish sculptor James Thom, and displayed it under a Norman Gothic shelter. He really needn't have bothered. In 1848, between April and December, Laurel Hill counted 48,000 visitors. Primarily, though, it was the private individuals who owned the lots who added to the built landscape. Wealthy people hired top architects and sculptors to design pieces for their family plots. The result was an eclectic display of architectural styles. Greek and Roman revivals were popular, but even more so were the more sentimental and romantic. Gothic revival appears quite frequently, as does my personal favorite, Egyptian revival. Just wait. Grim symbolism found on markers in older cemeteries, death heads and the like, was replaced by crosses, no longer limited to Catholic cemeteries, and a wide array of obelisks, cherubs, and other symbols. One critic has called this the golden age of American sculpture, a period that remains unsurpassed. Another characteristic of the movement was the extensive use of fencing, first seen at Grove Street Cemetery, but which spread to others quite rapidly. The rural cemetery movement was highly influential in American urban design, and led to significant innovations. A natural offshoot was the development of dedicated parks. New York art critic Clarence Cook recognized the immense popularity of the rural cemeteries, but noted the incongruity of combining a graveyard and a place of recreation. The truth is, he wrote in 1869, people were glad to get fresh air and a sight of grass, trees, and flowers, and now and then a pretty piece of sculpture, without considering too deeply whether it might not be better to have it all without the graves and funeral processions. Cook was writing a history of a project that had begun in 1851. New York's Central Park, designed by Frederick Law Olmsted, its streetscape and design heavily influenced by Mount Auburn and the other rural cemeteries. And beyond parks, 25 years after the founding of Mount Auburn, the rural cemeteries were inspiring the layout and naming of American suburbs and subdivisions, a trend which continues to this day. The rural cemetery movement also brought changes to the way Savannahans buried their dead. Planned as early as 1818, Laurel Grove Cemetery began accepting burials in 1853, and the effect of the movement is evident in its layout, its architecture, its sculpture, and its wide use of fencing. And yes, they even have Egyptian revival. But even more famous was Bonaventure, the focus of this exhibition. As Harry said, it began as a private cemetery for Bonaventure Plantation. Then, in 1846, Peter Wiltberger, a Savannah businessman and the proprietor of the Pulaski Hotel, purchased the plantation with the intention of turning 70 acres into a cemetery. But he died soon after, and it was his son, Major William H. Wiltberger, who formed the Evergreen Cemetery Company on June 12, 1868. And the cemetery, as we know it today, was born. With its meandering paths, lush plantings, and Gothic Spanish moss, Bonaventure quickly became a site for recreation and a tourist destination. A visitor to Savannah always made a sojourn out to Bonaventure, including John Muir, the founder of the Sierra Club, whose work led to the creation of Yosemite and Sequoia National Parks. He actually camped out a couple of nights in Bonaventure in 1867. He wrote, "I gazed awe-stricken as one new arrived from another world. Bonaventure is called a graveyard, a town of the dead, but the few graves are powerless in such a depth of life. The rippling living waters, the song of birds, the joyous confidence of flowers, the calm, undisturbable grandeur of the oaks mark this place of graves as one of the Lord's most favored abodes of life and light. News of Bonaventure spread far and wide. The British newspaper, the York Herald, featured the cemetery in a piece that appeared in August of 1874. On a bright day, when a stiff breeze is blowing through the odorous foliage, Savannah presents an aspect of gaiety and vivacity which is hardly Southern in character. Elegant equipages dash along the hard white roads leading to the pretty riverside resort known as Thunderbolt, or the somber, mystical aisle of Bonaventure Cemetery. Where the Tatnalls once lived in regal splendor, Savannah now buries its dead. There are many fine monuments in the Forest Cemetery, but no marble can vie in beauty and grandeur with the mighty yet graceful live oaks which spread their arched boughs and superb foliage. Following in the rural cemetery tradition, William Wiltberger created a masterpiece, one that has inspired visitors, nature lovers, architects, sculptors, painters, and photographers for the last 150 years. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris. It was awesome. I'm going to shift gears just a little bit and concentrate a little bit more on the visual artists who have worked at Bonaventure over time. I think it's really kind of an interesting and untold history, and years ago I started noticing that we had some objects in our permanent collection that were associated with Bonaventure. A wonderful 1860 painting, which you've already seen, works on long-term loan to the museum that were associated with Bonaventure, like the Byrd Girl. And that's sort of how this exhibition started. And at first I wasn't sure what I was going to find, but I came to find that a number of artists visual artists working in different media, from sculpture to painting to drawing to printmaking, have worked at Bonaventure over time. What you're looking at on screen right there is actually the emblem of an engraving of an artist's palette and brushes on the grave of Annie C. Cook, who was a painter who's represented in Telfair's permanent collection. And there are a number of Savannah artists who are represented out there and have their final resting places at Bonaventure. But let's look at some of the earliest painting inspired by Bonaventure. And the one you see there on the left is the earliest fine art painting of Bonaventure that I have seen, although the original is somewhere unknown. It exists only today as a photograph in the collection of the Georgia Historical Society. And this painting shows Mary Telfair, who is on the left, on horseback, visiting Bonaventure with friends, Sarah Campbell and Jay Farley, in 1834. Mary Telfair frequently took guests to Bonaventure beginning in the 1830s, which would have been its later days as a plantation, and continued to take guests to Bonaventure. If you read her letters, it was a place that she would take visiting friends and go with local friends as well. Mary Telfair has other connections to Bonaventure. Obviously, many of you have probably seen the Telfair family tomb out there. That tomb was created by Struthers and Sons, which is a marble yard stone carving outfit out of Philadelphia that operated for more than 3 generations. And that monument was created in 1860. And so all the Telfair family is sort of gathered there. Edward Telfair was moved from another plantation site, cemetery, to be reinterred there in the underground vault. Moving along to the little later 1830s, I apologize for the poor slide. I really encourage you to go up and take a look at this work in the exhibition. It's a fascinating painting of Bonaventure by the American artist Thomas Addison Richards, who is really an outstanding landscape painter and illustrator and travel writer. Richards was actually born in England. He was born in London and moved to the U.S. with his family in 1831 when he was about 11 years old. By 1838, he was living in Augusta, Georgia, where he was already painting and offering art lessons. He apparently had had some art instruction in England. And he started traveling Georgia making sketches, and he and his brother went into business and created a journal called Georgia Illustrated with some of Thomas Richards' scenes of Georgia. It may be during this time that he first visited Savannah and worked in Bonaventure. And we know that he and his brother also published an early Southern literary magazine called The Orion in the 1840s, in which the poem Bonaventure by Starlight by Henry Roots Jackson was published. So there was already kind of a focus of Bonaventure for him at that time, and it's certainly plausible that this painting could have been made that early while Bonaventure was still a plantation. And in this image, you see people, white visitors, kind of strolling through this bucolic setting, while on the right-hand side, you see a group of African-American figures. There's a woman, a man, and a child who appear to be engaged in labor. So this painting really points out these harsh contrasts of life in the antebellum era. And this may not be Richard's only attempt to portray Bonaventure. There are these two images which were published in Harper's Weekly in December of 1860 on the right. They bear Richards' name. They were engraved after drawings, presumably by Richards, showing the entrance to Bonaventure up top. And originally Bonaventure, you would have crossed this little bridge over a stream to get to the entrance to the cemetery. And up there you can see the original entry gate, which is this sort of rustic bentwood gate that you walk through. The lower image there is a view of Bonaventure that is strikingly similar to a painting in Telfair Museum's collection, the one on the left here by Henry Kleinwerk that you saw earlier. This is a really interesting painting. Kleinwerk was a Belgian-born artist who came to the U.S. probably in the late 1850s. Around 1860, he sets up shop in Savannah. He has a studio on Broughton Street. And he exhibits in Savannah that year 2 paintings of Bonaventure. One of them is this one, which was purchased by Edward Paddleford, whose tomb is also out there at Bonaventure. There's another one that's now lost. But this painting looks incredibly similar to the Richards print. And so the question is, did Kleinwerk base his work on a drawing by Richards, or did Richards work from the painting by Kleinwerk? And that's something we still don't know. Another thing that's interesting is that I talked to Lee Maltonfort, and we were trying to figure out exactly how this painting reflected Bonaventure at that time, and we came to realize that it's sort of a fabrication. The artist really exercised artistic license and rearranged some things to make it all fit in the same view, so that you can see, for example, the Tatnall family lot over here, the Clinch tomb here, far in the background there, that rustic arch gateway, and the Wilmington River over there. So the artist, again, was trying to kind of compress this view to fit all of these features of Bonaventure into that same painting. And again, this painting was exhibited twice in Savannah. 1860, Kleinwerk also draws a famous image of the raising of the flag of secession downtown Savannah, which was reproduced and spread widely as a print. He left the U.S. not long after this and did paintings in Cuba, the American West, and other locales. After the Civil War, there was an explosion of interest in Bonaventure by photographers, and one of the first photographers to really get these views of the cemetery out there to a wider public was George N. Barnard, who actually was following Sherman's troops on their march to the sea and photographed locations of battles, locations of the campaign along the way. He had to travel with this mobile photography rig that was very difficult to work with. And so he wound up coming back and photographing many of these same locations after the war. And he wound up producing this portfolio of images from the Sherman campaign. And in that portfolio, there are a number of images of Savannah, and you really see, comparing the images of Savannah to other locales he photographs, the degree to which Savannah was spared the destruction of other locations on the campaign. So in this portfolio, you have at least 2 images of Bonaventure. The one on the left there showing the Mongan and Tatnall tombs, graves, and on the right, I believe that's the Jones monument that you see through the trees there. Now, Barnard later set up shop in Charleston. He published other volumes, but this is really an incredible document, one that you find, this portfolio that you find in many museum collections. We were very happy to be able to borrow 2 of them for this exhibition. This is also around the time, just a year later actually, that John Muir visited and camped out in Bonaventure for like 5 nights, as Chris mentioned earlier. And between, written accounts like this, poems written about Bonaventure, photographs, that image of the cemetery spread far outside of Savannah. You also have, in the mid-19th century, the development of the stereopticon cards, which were the 19th century version of a VR headset, or at least a Viewmaster, which is probably a better analogy. But this technology, in which you could take 2 photographs side by side, which could be produced on a card, printed on, and mounted on a card. You view it through a stereopticon viewer with special lenses, and your eyes blend that image in your brain to give you the effect of a 3-dimensional image. We actually have some replicas that you can try out with a stereopticon viewer upstairs in the gallery after the lecture tonight. Now, the stereopticon views were often you'll have photographers working locally and then selling their images outside of Savannah. One of these photographers was D.J. Ryan, Daniel J. Ryan, and he did many, many views of Bonaventure. There were hundreds of stereo cards made of images of Bonaventure. D.J. Ryan was probably one of the most prolific. J.N. Wilson was another. You see one of his pieces on the left, Wilson and Company, and O. Pierre Havens. And Wilson and Havens were in business for a while together. But these views of the avenues of oaks were incredibly popular. There were just tons of them out there, as well as views of the original gate at Bonaventure, people picnicking at Bonaventure, famous tombs from Bonaventure, particularly the Clinch tomb and others that were favored by these producers of stereopticon, stereo cards. Now, one thing we haven't really gotten into tonight yet are the sculptors who worked at Bonaventure. And of course, Bonaventure, along with Laurel Grove, Catholic Cemetery, and others here, it's an incredible repository of funerary art. And there were some terrific sculptors working right here in Savannah, and I wanted to at least briefly mention some of them. Robert Dee Walker is one who actually worked very close to where you're sitting right now. This was his stone yard on the block of York Street, where the entrance to the Jepson Center is now located. It was right across from Trinity Church, so it was where the townhouses are now, next to the Jepson Center. And there you see his sign, and there's the stone yard here to the right. We don't know whether these were all imported from somewhere else, maybe up north, and Walker did additional carving here, or whether he was carving monuments like that here. It might have been a bit of both. This is an example of one of his markers out at Bonaventure for Julius Cooks. There's also an obelisk like this one in the Bacon plot out there. In fact, the Bacon plot has several of Walker's sculptures. And you find Walker's work throughout Bonaventure and at Savannah's other historic cemeteries. Actually, there were several stone yards on York Street in the 19th century and just after the turn of the 20th century. But the artist who's probably the most synonymous with Bonaventure and with the funerary art of Bonaventure is this artist, John Walls, a German-born sculptor who is responsible for, I think Lee told me there are at least 72 confirmed Walls pieces that have been identified at Bonaventure, probably more. He also, his work can also be found at the Catholic Cemetery, at Laurel Grove, and at cemeteries outside of Savannah. But Walls, started out as a fine art sculptor. Actually, that's probably not true. He came to the U.S. Initially to live with his sister after his parents died. And he lived with his older sister in Philadelphia. He began working as a stonecutter as a youth and apparently saved up enough money to go back to Europe to study sculpture. He studied in Paris, with M.A. Millet, and then went on to Vienna, where he studied with Professor Victor Tillner, and we'll see where that led him in just a moment. Karl Brandt, the bust that you see here, this is a plaster bust made by Walls. It's a portrait of Telfair's first director. And Brandt is the one who's really responsible, I think, for bringing Walls to Savannah, because when he was going to Europe to purchase work for the Telfair Academy, which would not open until 1886, Brandt was in Europe in 1883. He goes to Victor Tillner's workshop in Vienna and orders a set of 5 sculptures of famous artists of history that would be placed in front of the Telfair. And working in Tillner's studio is John Walls. And Walls comes to Savannah to oversee the installation of those pieces. Walls would also do other public sculpture here in addition to his work in the cemeteries. There you see a beautiful figurative group that are over the main entrance to the Savannah-Chatham County Board of Education building on Bull Street, formerly the Chatham Academy and Old Savannah High School building. But here's a view of the Telfair Academy as it's coming into to fruition here, and we're seeing a construction photograph. You can see all the scaffolding up around the building, and out in front of the building you'll see these 5 plinths, and on top of them there are these crates which contain sculpture. Walls is said to have worked on the figure of Raphael, one of the 5 artists represented out in front of the Telfair Academy building. But he's best known today to us, to most visitors to Savannah, for this really beautiful portrait of Gracie Watson, which is probably the most visited sculpture in Bonaventure today, made in 1894 for the grieving parents of this little girl. It's beautifully sculpted. It's very sensitively done, and Walls apparently only had a photograph to work from making this work. He made numerous other figurative sculptures in Bonaventure and other cemeteries. There's the Gertrude Bliss McMillan monument here. There's actually a nearly identical figure at a cemetery in Macon, also by Walls. Up to the on the left there, a portrait of representation of the 2 Whaleless children, completed in 1906. On the right, the Schaefer Monument at Bonaventure, this beautifully carved tree trunk with ivy, palm fronds, and a little Tempest Fugit flying hourglass there in drapery. Gorgeous monument. Walls was not the only sculptor working in Savannah, though, in the early days of the 20th century. In 1910, he is said to have brought another sculptor to Savannah, Antonio Alifi, to help him in his carving business. Alifi was born in Sicily. He actually, as a young man, he apprenticed in his family's stone carving yard. So he had training before he came to the U.S., and that may have made him attractive to Walls. When he came here, he worked initially for Walls, but then eventually went into business for himself, established his own stone yard for a while, and then later worked as a contractor for Oglethorpe Marble and Granite Company. What we're looking at here on the screen on the upper left is a wonderful photograph showing Mr. Alifi there standing with the flood monument at the Catholic cemetery, which he carved, and this beautiful angel that you see on the left. He's also, his name doesn't appear much on monuments in Bonaventure or the other cemeteries. He rarely signed his work. The flood monument is signed. There is another signed piece at Bonaventure, but he's said to have made this monument to another Italian immigrant, Sebastiano Orsini, in Bonaventure. And he did other work as well. This is a studio piece he did, this lion, this golden lion, which was cast in plaster for the Sons of Italy, a fraternal Italian organization in New York City, established in the early 20th century. Their newsletter today is still called The Golden Lion, by the way. But this may have been cast in bronze as well as plaster. And it's a beautifully fluid animal sculpture. Alifi also worked out of Savannah. He did contract work on large projects outside of the city, locations like Mount Rushmore, Stone Mountain, in Atlanta, and others. And then we also have, right here in Savannah, the oldest operating stone yard in the city, and one of the city's real treasures, I think, Oglethorpe Marble and Granite, founded by G.B. Little, who came to Savannah from Charleston, I believe, initially, and set up his practice in Savannah. He was really kind of an entrepreneur, a businessman involved with many different things. He had his own car dealership, an Oldsmobile dealership in Savannah. He quickly bought out other stone companies in the city. So really by 1912, he was really kind of the major owner of a stone yard in the city. And he produced all kinds of monuments, large and small, for all of the city's cemeteries, he and his company. And some of these were carved locally. Some of them were imported and then customized for customers here in Savannah. This is some really interesting material that Mr. and Mrs. Mobley loaned for this exhibition. I really found this fascinating. This is a catalog of Italian statuary with an imprint of Canton, Georgia, the Georgia Marble Finishing Works. And there are Italian statues that you could order and have them here in Savannah. They could be customized, set, with carved with the names of the deceased. And here you see the Prendergast Monument in Bonaventure, which is either based on or may be a directly imported piece that you see from this catalog. Another early catalog the Mobleys shared with us for this exhibition, this very early, probably from around 1908, catalog of available, or of some of the monuments produced by Oglethorpe Marble and Granite Company, often featuring the names of prominent Savannah families who were their customers. On the right is a drawing signed by G.B. Little, which is for a study for a Schroeder mausoleum. There are two Schroeder mausoleums in Bonaventure, and the drawing most closely resembles the EAM Schroeder mausoleum that you see there. And as I mentioned, it was signed by G.B. Little, but G.B. Little's son, Milton Little, was also very active from a very young age designing monuments. He carved his first monument at the age of 11 and worked until 1980, incredibly. In fact, the image you see on the right there of the Gibbons Monument from Bonaventure, the first one was created in the 1920s. He later created a suite of these same similar designs for that family up until about 1980 when he lost his eyesight. I also found a really interesting reference to Oglethorpe Marble in an early stone magazine from 1914, which mentions a new marble gateway that had been installed at the entrance to Bonaventure. And it's like, well, the gateways of Bonaventure are granite, and they weren't installed in 1914. But I think what they were talking about was actually this beautiful marble gateway in Bonaventure's Jewish section. Now I'm going to shift gears a little bit here from Bonaventure to another cemetery, because this cemetery became part of Bonaventure, really an extension of Bonaventure in the early 20th century. And it has its own fascinating history that I won't go into in detail tonight, but I encourage you to go take a look at the exhibition upstairs and explore it a little bit further. Greenwich was another colonial era plantation that was situated on the Thunderbolt Bluff, just down from Bonaventure on the Wilmington River. And it passed through several hands. Early on, it was used for the growing of soybeans. Samuel Bowen was growing soybeans there, one of the first places where they were grown in North America. But by the late 19th century, it passed into other hands. In 1874, it operated as a German rifle club. And then in the 1890s, it was purchased by Spencer P. Schotter, who was really the king of naval stores. His American naval stores business was based in Savannah, and it controlled naval stores, the naval store market throughout the world at the turn of the century. So he was incredibly wealthy, and he had this massive mansion built on the Thunderbolt Bluff there at Greenwich. And it was a 40-room mansion. It was designed by Engel and Auberall, who were Beaux-Arts architects based in New York. It was this really opulent house. If anyone, does anyone know Eleanor Torrey West, Sandy West? Or I'm sure you know of her. This was her house when she was a child. Because Spencer Schotter had a reversal in fortune. An antitrust suit was brought against him, and he wound up losing his not only this mansion, but another one in Lenox, Massachusetts. And he sold the mansion along with all of its furnishings, its fine art. He was a fine art collector. He sold that to Dr. H.N. Torrey of Detroit, who moved here. And of course, this is Sandy West's father. And The collections, the art collections that were at Greenwich remained when the Tories were living at Greenwich, including these paintings which no longer survive that were in the house at Greenwich, and the marble statuary that Schotter bought directly, bought it in Rome and had it shipped to Savannah for the sculpture gardens that were also on the property. Now, unfortunately, Greenwich suffered a massive fire and burned to the ground in 1923, taking all the art inside with it, and the Tories narrowly escaped that blaze. I think it was an electrical fire. But the grounds remained, and even in its later days, before the fire, Greenwich really became known. It was featured in architectural magazines and served as the set for several silent movies. In fact, there were at least 4 silent movies shot at Greenwich, one of them starring Rudolph Valentino. This is a still here from the film Stolen Moments, originally filmed in 1920 and re-released after Valentino became a big movie star in 1922. And you see aspects of Greenwich in several scenes in the film. In this case, the actress Marguerite Namara is shown running past some of the statuary that Spencer Schotter acquired for Greenwich. Some of the Roman busts here, another French sculpture which you can see today at the Telfair Academy. So after the fire, Greenwich sits empty there, and then the city purchases the property in 1933 and develops it as the Greenwich addition to Bonaventure Cemetery, and it's been a cemetery since that time. There's still some original features out there, the original ponds that were part of the Schotter estate, and a beautiful stone fountain is still out there. The sculptures were placed into storage by the city of Savannah, and then in 1965, a number of them were loaned to the Telfair Museum, and they've been across the street at the Telfair Academy ever since. And we moved a few of them over here so that you could see them in the context of this exhibition tonight. Now, shifting back to Bonaventure, we were talking about sculpture earlier, and sculpture certainly continued to be a factor in the environment of Bonaventure into the 20th century. Here we see, of course, a sculpture that needs no introduction, very little explanation at this point. Sylvia Shaw Judson's Byrd Girl, the bronze sculpture from 1936, which was featured on the cover of Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil in Jack Leigh's famous photograph. On the right, there's still bronze sculpture being made at Bonaventure, or being installed at Bonaventure in recent times. This monument to Julia Backus Smith by Kevin Conlon, who's a former professor at Savannah College of Art and Design. And shifting back to some of the fine arts inspired by Bonaventure, painters in the 20th century really discovered Bonaventure, and here's where it really becomes this sort of popular place for artists to go. In the 1920s, the Telfair was the home to the Savannah Art Club, and the artists involved in the Savannah Art Club were going out and painting in plein air, working on site at various locations. Some of those artists you see here, artists like Emma Wilkins, whose parents, whose mother and grandmother were both miniature painters, but she was really an accomplished still life painter and landscape painter. This is a view of red azaleas at Bonaventure, which were a really, really favorite subject of many artists working in the early to mid 20th century. Another work also of red azaleas by Hattie Saucy, another terrific Savannah painter who was just featured in an exhibition at the Telfair Academy this past year. Another view by Hattie Saucy shows a sailboat out there on the Wilmington River looking through the trees, and in this case you don't see any of the monuments. So a lot of artists were really drawn to go out there just for the landscape, and they're painting in this American Impressionist mode that was popular among Savannah artists in the 1920s and even a little later. Getting to the mid-20th century, we have artists like Gina Nee, who came here with her husband, Alexander Brooke, who was sort of a focal point for an art colony on the Savannah River in the 1930s and 40s. She first came to Savannah in the 40s when she married Brooke, and did this lovely semi-abstract painting of Bonaventure. It's just called Savannah Graveyard, but from the figure that you see here, does everybody recognize this little figure? It's Gracie, yeah. So by the pose, we can recognize that as Gracie and that this is identified as Bonaventure. A little bit later, we have Louis Boucher, another prominent American artist, comes to Savannah. He's also a friend of Alexander Brooke and visits Savannah several times. This work is not dated, but has to be from the late 40s to about 1960. We know he came to Savannah a few times during that period. And these three young women are shown, they're possibly tourists. This one young lady here actually has a folding camera in her hand, taking pictures out there. And they're standing in the colic plot at Bonaventure, And sadly, the monument that you see right here was destroyed by Hurricane Matthew. It has not been restored or reassembled yet, but it was really literally broken to bits by a tree. Moving on, other artists working in painting, printmaking, drawing, working at Bonaventure, David DeLorme did a wonderful series of etchings based on monuments at Bonaventure. The three female figures that you see here. DeLorme was a former motorcycle race driver as well as a fine artist. He trained at the Pennsylvania Academy of Arts, but he was also kind of an adventurer and racer. But he was also drawn to the human figure and fell in love with the statuary of Bonaventure. Jeff Markowski is a contemporary painter who's working on plein air, like these artists of the early 20th century, going out there and painting directly, capturing the atmosphere, the qualities of light and color. There's also, in addition to these more straightforward representations, there's also this sort of magic realist tendency in work made at Bonaventure in more recent times. This is a painting from 1992 by Virginia Derryberry, who is a former professor at Savannah College of Art and Design. She later taught at the University of North Carolina in Asheville for many years. And she painted this while she was in Savannah teaching at SCAD. And she takes these figurative monuments of sort of out of context and relocates them in this kind of new interplay with these dreamlike elements like the swans that you see there and these really sort of almost imaginary flowers that surround them. There's also an unearthly quality in photography that's been made at Bonaventure in the 20th century. This work is by Edward Weston, the great 20th century photographer, and this was made as part of a series for an illustrated version of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. A publishing company in New York was putting out this special portfolio edition of Leaves of Grass, and Weston traveled the country in 1941 taking photographs, and he came through Savannah and took this image of Bonaventure. I think he took something like 700 photographs in that journey, and 49 of them I think were ultimately reproduced in the book. Other photographers working in the 20th century in Bonaventure include Maria von Mathiasen, whose work here on the left, The Crowning Glory hairdo, was part of a series called The Magical Self, in which she worked with local African-American hairstylists to reinterpret various locations around the city, from the Shabazz restaurant to the Owens Thomas House slave quarters to cemeteries like Bonaventure. In this case, the model is here placed directly under this carved pair of hands who appear to be placing a crown on the model's head. On the right, Dick Bjornseth, another photographer working in Savannah, has taken something like, I think he told me, 1,400 images of Bonaventure and other local cemeteries. He's also taken these sort of unearthly infrared images, like the one you see here, where the colors reflects a color scheme that we can't see, that humans can't see, but you can capture with special film or special cameras, and it provides, again, this kind of unearthly quality. But now what I'd like to do is turn the floor over to someone who can tell you a bit more about the most famous photograph ever taken at Bonaventure Cemetery. I'm going to skip ahead so that, to set this up for her here. But many of you know Susan Laney, who is a local curator, a gallerist. She is the gallerist or proprietor of Laney Contemporary, which I hope many of you have visited. She's an independent curator as well. She's had more than 20 years experience in the fine art market. She specializes in photography and contemporary art from emerging and established artists. And she's a curator. She's organized numerous group and solo exhibitions in galleries, colleges, and museums, including Jack Leigh Full Circle, Low Country Photographs, 1972 to 2004 at the SCAD Museum of Art, which was selected by Hyperallergic.com as one of the top 10 exhibitions in the U.S. for 2014. She curated 5 exhibitions with the Savannah College of Art and Design, including Persona, Stephanie Howard, Time and Place, and Eternity, Ain't Bad, Vision to Reality, Kevin Cooley, High Water Mark, and Pamela Wiley, Now the Once. She is currently working on an exhibition featuring the works of photographer Elaine Mays, which will open at the SCAD Museum, I think in 2018, is that right? Is that right, Susan? Okay, great. And here today she's going to talk to you a little bit more about the making again of the most famous photograph ever taken in Bonaventure. Please welcome Susan Laney.
Thank you, Harry. I'm going to focus in a little bit more. You guys covered quite a bit of ground. And I just want to say I'm honored and pleased to be asked to speak here today about Jack Leigh and the story around making his famous photograph, Midnight, Bonaventure Cemetery, which has become an icon for Savannah and is one of the most widely recognized artworks to come from this region. Jack Leigh's was the career of a seminal Southern photographer who devoted the majority of his life to capturing on film the traditional and changing landscapes, industries, and people of Savannah and the surrounding Low Country. Did anyone here know Jack? Yes. Not about 10 or 20 of you, maybe? Did any of you hear him speak? Yeah? Maybe even here. If you knew him or heard him speak, you know what an amazing storyteller he was, and I'm not that kind of storyteller, but I'm going to do my best to tell his story of this. Jack's indelible spirit and influence has forever marked me and so many others, and even though I have known his work for over 2 decades, it continues to inspire and enlighten me. Jack was one of my closest friends and a mentor for years, and those two things fit seamlessly into one another. I learned much about life from the way he faced his with clarity and seized and created opportunities to do the work he was so passionate about. He also gave back to me and to so many others, some of whom are here tonight. What I learned from years of working with Jack has now helped me to open my own gallery, and I am thrilled to be able to continue to oversee the legacy of his work. I would now like to read an excerpt from Pat Conroy's foreword in Jack Leigh's retrospective book, The Land I'm Bound To. Jack Leigh is the only person I have ever known to become famous because he walked into a graveyard. His emblematic, mood-altering photograph of a statue of a young girl with her strange and withdrawn equipoise sounded the perfect note to John Barrett's perfect book about Savannah, Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil. Jack's photograph captured with unerring accuracy the edgy, seamy, and unpredictable underbelly of a Savannah the world had not seen before. The photograph and the book are now joined at the hip, inseparable, iconic, and seamless. For Jack, this single photograph became his benchmark, his humdinger, his Lollapalooza, and the corker he knocked out of the park. With one click of a shutter, he produced one of the most famous photographs ever taken by an American and changed the course of his own life forever. And now I will talk a little bit about how the image came to be. In 1993, Jack was contacted by Random House and asked to make a cover image for the book that John Barrett had just finished. They sent him some galley proofs, and after reading, he immediately decided that he should not have anything to do with it. But he quickly reconsidered. The thought that even if the book turned out to be controversial and included some drama about his friends and family members, and Jack knew everyone, that the book would at least have an incredible cover. He decided that Bonaventure was the place, and he set out to make a photograph in the 2 days they gave him. He was able to borrow the keys from the cemetery, and Jack stayed the first night until well past midnight to get the feel and to get into the mood to make the image that would grace the cover of the book. The next day, he took photographs that were interesting, but not quite what he wanted. As the light began to fade, he saw her, Sylvia Shaw Judson's Byrd Girl, who was a garden statue and possibly one of the only markers not originally meant for a grave. You would have to confirm that one. Even though he was quite familiar with the cemetery and had many close family members, including his mother and father, buried there, he had never seen her before and knew nothing about her except that she was perfect for the image that he wanted to make. He exposed for the light to make the image that he had pre-visualized for the cover. And I'll show you a little bit more about that in a minute. The next day, Jack made test prints of the image, and as this was 1993, and email was just getting its start, and Jack certainly wasn't there yet, he overnighted them to Random House. They knew Jack had chosen Bonaventure to make the photograph, and were expecting to see multiple options to choose from, but he sent them only one. As Jack told the story, John Brandt was in the middle of shaving his face when he got a call, and he rushed over to the Random House offices to see the images that were proposed. It was perfect, and the rest is history. The book sold more than 5 million copies, and spent a record 216 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list, helping power Savannah's tourist industry. Soon after the book came out, people began to seek Jack out. This started with knocks on his studio door, and soon he pulled up the blinds a little and put the book on the other side of the blinds and lowered them back down. The knocks increased. The interest around the image on the cover of the book allowed Jack to open his gallery, Southern Images, which was on the corner of Abercorn and Oglethorpe Street, and it later became the Jack Leigh Gallery. He soon had scores of people coming to the gallery to buy the photo and to see his other works. No one imagined how successful it would be. Midnight, the photo, and the book was and is a phenomenon. There have been many copies of his image and copyright infringements through the years, the most notable being Warner Brothers movie marketing that used a movie-fied version of Jack's photograph, which they had to recreate as the Byrd Girl was no longer in the cemetery at that time. Jack's interest was in protecting not only his image, but the art of photography, and this, in the end, created a precedent-setting case in copyright law, Leigh versus Warner Brothers. He had 2 lawyers, they had 11, I think. So, y'all know this one. The art of the darkroom and pre-visualization played a key role in the Midnight image. The mood and the atmosphere that Jack wanted to convey was just as much of the subject as the subject itself. The image is one of the more complex images that Jack ever printed. Ben Beasley, Jack's longtime printing assistant, who later printed his work, is here tonight if any of you want to further discuss this after this lecture. Ben, raise your hand. It's Ben. Okay, I'm not used to this thing here. Let's see. So this is in the Granite section. Live Oak and Pond was taken in 1999 and was the cover of Jack's retrospective book. And this image is in the exhibition upstairs. I wanted to put 2 beds, 2 windows on the cover of the book, but when Jack came up with the title, The Land I'm Bound To, this was a much more fitting image. And this is Pond Reflection, also taken in 1999. Although a prolific photographer in this region, the Jack Leigh images included in this exhibition were the only photos he took in Bonaventure and Greenwich. This is a snapshot of the Byrd Girl that Jack used when talking about the art of photography. I believe one of his friends made it for him right around the time that he made his image, probably just after. This is what you would walk up to and how she was placed at the time. It's a contact sheet. And the following slides will show a glimpse into the creation of the mood for the final image. So he had 2 days, but he had something in mind that he really wanted to convey, this mood, light, feeling. So this is showing different times of exposure, 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 15. Changing the f-stop. And this is the initial work print. So this is what a straight photograph looked like before he did any burning and dodging. So this is where you start to see what he wanted to get to. And this is the template that shows the markup on how many passes of light and actions were done to make the final image. When speaking with Ben earlier about this, he spoke about the difficulty of printing this because of the backlighting of the Byrd Girl in the scene. When printing in the darkroom, Jack and Ben would write down the steps necessary on a dry erase board next to letters. So normally this would be A, B, C. Midnight was A through X, 24 steps. Each print would take many hours to make, and they described it as an intricate dance of movements to create the image. To accompany this dance, there were particular soundtracks that Jack would listen to. Blade Runner was a favorite. And there's the final image. And this one I just included for fun. This is an image of Jack in 1995 when he was unpacking a rare plaster cast of the Byrd Girl that he bought from the family of the sculptor, from Alice Hayes, to be displayed in a recreation of his photograph at the Savannah History Museum. And I believe the actual statue at the time was in storage at Bonaventure because most people thought that the masses visiting the cemetery would eventually start to die down, as we now know that never happened. Bonaventure was the original inspiration for Jack to create Midnight and continues to be an inspiration to artists, sculptors, students, and photographers. And like many of the other artists that Harry mentioned, Jack is also buried at Bonaventure. To bring it all full circle, as Jack liked to say, I would like to read you an excerpt from a speech that he gave in 1999 at the Telfair Museum for a photography exhibition that he curated, Through a Glass Clearly. The medium of photography offers only the potential for meaning. In and of itself, like a tool or instrument, it is only as meaningful as the person using it. A piano doesn't give us music, but when played by a true musician to translate the music in one's heart, then the piano becomes an instrument of divine intention, shaping the experience into music. We have shaped tools and instruments from the beginning of time to give form to our evolving quest for truth, beauty, and meaning. Why did we create the piano? To shape and translate sound into the highest form of experience, music. Why did we create the camera? To shape and translate sight into the highest form of experience, what we call a photograph. Working with light and time, photography has provided us with a capacity to look through the glass of our own experience and clearly see that truth and beauty surround us in ways we never before imagined. The intensity of experience that is photography involves an awareness, a heightened form of appreciation of the nature of our human connection with reality. Photography sharpens the capacity to be creatively present to an actual moment in time, to be able to feel deeply as possible the emotion generated by a cluster of clouds, a fleeting expression, afternoon light on a row of townhouses, the rolling in of morning fog, and it is the personal experience of the human being, the photographer, that gives the moment its meaning. The truth is the meaning we have experienced. The form of the experience is the photograph. Thank you.
Thank you guys so much for coming out tonight. Please enjoy the exhibition.